Today's daf is daf Ayin Dalid, and we begin on the top of the Amud. Rav Yosef Kamed Rav Huna. So Rav Yosef is in the presence of Rav Huna, and you'll see after Rav Yosef presents what he presents, then Rav Huna is going to respond. The Yosef come, and here's what Rav Yosef has to say. Omar Rav Yehuda Omar Rav. So we're talking about what's called an Aver HaMeduldal, which was the subject of the sugya of yesterday's daf on Ayin Gimel. And the question is whether the Aver HaMeduldal, which is a limb that's dangling outside of the animal, whether or not it's Aver Minachai. If it's Aver Minachai, then you get malchus for eating it. And that's exactly what Rav Yosef reports in the name of Rav Yehuda, the name of Rav. And as this presentation was going on, in Rav Yosef presenting to Rav Huna, one of the Rabbanon was there, and he said, like with a lot of gusto, he said, Lo titzaisule. Don't listen to this presentation. Don't accept it. That you would get malchus for eating Aver Menachai in the case of an Aver HaMeduldal, because again, it's still basically attached to the mother, to the animal. It's not an Aver that's unto itself. In fact, Hachi Omer Rav Yitzchak Bar Shmuel Bar Matu B'Shmei de Rav, we have a tradition in the name of Rav that a chol is eno loke, that if somebody eats an Aver HaMeduldal, he does not get malchus. In other words, that we're not dealing with any sort of an iser of Aver Menachai min Torah, because it's still attached to the body. Amalei Rav Huna. Rav Huna responds now to Rav Yosef, who had made this presentation, and then there was an argument against that presentation. Anana man nisbal. I'm confused, says Rav Huna. I have Shnei Ksuim Achishim Zetz. On the one hand, you're claiming in the name of Rav that you get malchus for eating an Aver HaMeduldal. It's Aver Menachai. On the other hand, we have a tradition from Rav Yitzchak Bar Shmuel in the name of Rav that you don't get malchus. Ahadre Rav Yosef le'api. Rav Yosef turns around. Now, when Rav Yosef turns his face around, it means that why didn't you figure this out on your own? That's what we call body language. Amalei, and now Rav Yosef says to Rav Huna, my kusha, why do you find some sort of irreconcilable contradiction between these two statements? Ki amri ana, when I said that in the name of Rav you get malchus for an Aver HaMeduldal, that's b'misa di osa nipol. But ki amar iu b'shchita de eno osa nipol. So let's understand again what osa nipol is all about. And the question is whether or not, and the word nipol means to sever the attachment, whether or not the Aver HaMeduldal is detached or not detached. Again, if it's detached, then it would be Aver Menachai. If it's not detached, it still belongs to the Chai, so it's not Minachai. Now, whether or not it's attached depends on whether it dies naturally or through Shechita. Why? Because we have this fundamental distinction, the Gemara soon is going to derive it from Psukim, that in the case of Shechita, then we say that Eno Osa Nipol, meaning we don't view the Aver HaMeduldal as it was detached from the limb, from the animal, and therefore the Shechita of the animal is going to be what's called Mitayr Midei Nevela. But in a case where the animal dies naturally, then we say Misa Osa Nipol. And if Misa Osa Nipol, which is again the sugya on the previous daf, then when the animal just dies naturally, then we view the Aver HaMedulda as it was detached. That's called Nipol. Nipol means attached. And therefore, it's not Nevela, but rather Aver Menachai. Now let's explain what's the difference between Aver Menachai and Nevela. In both cases, if you eat a Kazayas Nevela, you get Malchus, and if you eat Aver Menachai, you get Malchus. But the fundamental difference is what happens if you take some flesh off either nevela or Aver Menachai. So in the case of Aver Menachai, if you would cut off some of the flesh from that Aver, from that limb, then that flesh is not Aver Menachai, because Aver Menachai has to be a complete limb with a bone, a ligament, and flesh. Once you cut off the flesh, if you eat it, then you're not in violation of Aver Menachai. But in the case of nevela, it doesn't matter how much, as long as you have a kazais, but I'm saying it doesn't matter that you chopped off some of the flesh. So now what we're saying is that in the case of Avraham Meduldal, if the animal dies naturally, then we say that we view that Avraham Meduldal as if it was Avraham Menachai, as if it was Nipol. Nipol means it's detached. And since it's detached, therefore, if you eat it, says Rav Yosef in this tradition in the name of Rav, you get malchus for that because you're eating Aver Menachai. Again, it's not nevela, but it's Aver Menachai. However, in the case of shchita, as the Gemara again, as I said before, is going to derive from Sukkim, that as a result of shchita, there's no detachment, there's no nipol, because shchita eno osa nipol, which means that the Aver Meduldal is not Aver Menachai, it's not detached, it's still attached to the animal, and the shchita of the animal is going to be effective even for that Aver. Now, all this has to do with the Shita of Rabbi Yochanan that we had on the previous Amud, and now we're saying that the way Rav Yosef presents Rav agrees with Rabbi Yochanan. So now we start, in a sense, today's main topic, and that is from whence do we know? Amarav Minani Milsa. What's the source from which the Rabbanan derive this distinction between if the animal died naturally, which is called Misa Osa Nipol, as opposed, in contrast to Shchita Sheina Osa Nipol. Dichsiv. We're going to now start with a pasuk in Vayikra Perek Yud Aleph. Now, the context of this pasuk is very important for us to keep in mind. It has to do with a dead sheretz. And the Torah is going to say here, Kol asher yipol alav mehem b'mosam. So let's underline the word b'mosam. Yitma mikol kli eitz, o beged, o or, o sak, kol kli asher yosem lochu b'hem b'mayim yuva, v'tomei at ha'erev v'toher. So the Gemara now wants to know, when the Torah goes out of its way to say that kol asher yipol olav mehem b'mosam yitma, that's a mute. And that's telling me that although, again, as I said before, the context is a dead sheretz, the Torah is saying that there's going to be tuma here, and it's referring not to a sheretz, and that's going to be the Eino Inyan we'll get to just momentarily, but rather it's referring to a kosher animal. Now, what are we saying now about a kosher animal after it dies? Ilema, if we're going to say that this miyut is coming to exclude lemuti v'chayeihem, that in other words, where let's say a sheretz would fall upon something that's alive, well, I'm sorry, when they're alive, well, we know that a sheretz is not metame until after it dies, because minivlasam nafka, the Torah says that when is it that this sheretz is metame if it falls on something? Only if it's a carcass, if it's minivlasam, meaning it's dead already. Ella, so therefore we have to take this out of context, as Gemara is going to point out in a minute, And we're going to say that Misa Osa Nipol Ve'en Shchita Osa Nipol. That means b'mosam, since it repeats itself twice in the pasuk, it says Kol Asher Yipol Mehem, and it says b'mosam. So obviously the Torah is saying something about Misa. And again, if we take the pasuk out of its context, we're talking about Misa of a kosher animal. And that means that if the animal, the kosher animal that has this Aver Amiduldal, that's a dangling Aver, a limb, then b'mosam, did the animal die of a natural death, not because of shchita, then it's called osa nipo, which means that it becomes detached. And if it's detached, then it has the status of Aver Menachai. If, on the other hand, shchita was performed, then we say that since the Aver Meduldal is still connected to the mother, therefore the shchita is meaningful for the mother, and it's not Aver Menachai, but rather it's Mitayr Midei Nevela. Amalei Rav Adavar Aval Rav Vahak Rabik Shrotzim Ksiv. Amalei Rav responds that we have to apply a different methodology of analyzing the psukim Eino Inyan, meaning that if it's not necessary in the context of shrotzim, because that's obviously a dead sheretz, and that we derive from the pasuk minivlasam, and not only that, this entire concept of shchita is inapplicable to shrotzim. I mean, if you take a sheretz and you shecht it, nothing is accomplished. There's no meaningfulness or significance at all to shchita in a sheretz. Labnei shchita in it. So therefore, we must take this pasuk out of its context, and that's called Tnei Le'inyan Behema. We have to apply this pasuk as if it was introduced by the word Behema, because we're talking about something that could be subject to shchita, and that's only a Behema, not a sheretz. And then the word b'mosam, which, as we said, is repeated twice, and we don't need it, it's totally unnecessary. So it's coming to tell me that the shchita, which is not b'mosam, that's the mute, that, if it's b'mosam, then it becomes tameh. But if it's not b'mosam, meaning it didn't die a natural death, but rather it was shechted, then osa eno osa nipol, which means that it doesn't create Aver Menachai, but rather the shchita itself has an impact and is valid vis-a-vis the Aver HaMeduldal. So when the Torah adds the extra word b'mosam, it's coming for the purpose of teaching that only b'mosam do we have this nipol, meaning only if the animal died of a natural death, then it creates a detachment for the dangling limbs, meaning the Aver HaMeduldal, and therefore the Aver HaMeduldal becomes Aver Menachai. But shchita does not create detachment, and therefore the dangling limb, the Aver HaMeduldal, is not Aver Menachai. And again, all this is based on the fact that in Eino Inyan, we can't apply this teaching to shrotzim. I mean, there's no difference between b'mosam and b'shchita in the case of dead sheretz. Then we have to apply it in the case of the animal. And the Torah in Mosam is coming to contrast a natural death with a shchita death, and telling me the power and the halachic status of the shchita. So now the Gemara comes back and says, you know what? There may be a need for this pasuk in its context, meaning regard to shrotzim. Because the question is, what sheretz that dies, binavlasam, is metame if it falls on something? There are two types of shrotzim after they're dead. There's shrotzim immediately after the death, and then there's shrotzim that remain for a certain period of time. That's the difference between lachim and yeveshin. Akatim iboile ke'ein misa. Maybe what the Torah is telling you is that the reason why when a sheretz falls on something, a dead sheretz, it's metame that thing, that's only because it's kimosam, right? That was the word that we had, kimosam, which means that it's within a certain close period of time to its death. And that's called lachem, while the dead sheretz still has the moisture of its body before it dries up. Yeveshim ein metame. But if it's not, as we said before, kim mosam, right? I'm sorry, bim mosam, and it's not at the time of its death, it became yavesh, then it's not metame. So Gemara says, you're right. The word b'mosam, I must concede, is going to teach me halach and shrotzim as far as what kind of sheretz is metame. But trei b'mosam, we have to remind ourselves that the pasuk repeats it, the word b'mosam twice, so we can learn two things from b'mosam. As the pasuk says, Ela atmeim lachem b'chol sheretz kol anoger b'hem b'mosam. That's the first. Yitma ad ha'arev. And then the very next pasuk says, Kol asher yipol alav mehem b'mosam yitma. So we have the word b'mosam twice. And now we're going to say that the first b'mosam is going to teach me that shrotzim are only metame if they're similar to the situation that they were in the death, meaning they are lachin. And the second word, b'mosam, is coming to be memayit, the opposite of a natural death, which means a shchita death, to tell us that although in the case of misa, which is a natural death, it's osa nipol, but in the case of shchitas, eno osa nipol. Now, at this point, the Gemara goes back to the original question of a protruding limb, which means that the fetus, the embryo, extended its foreleg outside of the womb of its mother's body, and then they shechted the mother. And we said that although that shechita could not effectuate a permission to allow you to consume that limb, because that limb is already chutzim chitza, so it has the status of treifa, but nevertheless, the shechita is meaningful, at least according to the Chachamim of Reb Meir, to be mitayer the foreleg of the fetus midei nevela, midei tuma. Rav Chisda, the machlokes between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim is be'ever di uber chai. Aval be'ever di uber mes, divrei hakol shchita osa nipol. According to Rav Chisda, even Rabbi Meir, in a fundamental sense, accepts the principle of shchita osa nipol. And therefore, in the case where the uber is dead, then even Rabbi Meir would agree that the shchita. No, I'm sorry. I meant to say the other way around. Even Chachamim, who say that shchita eina nosa nipol, that's only because the mother is alive. So since the mother is alive, the Rabbanan hold that the shechita of the mother is meaningful even as far as the foreleg is concerned. But according to Rav Chisda, the Chachamim will agree to Rabbi Meir that shechita osa nipol, meaning that the mother's shechita is not meaningful for the protruded foreleg of the fetus, in the case of ubar mes, in the case where the fetus is dead. Now, as we view the fetus as part of the mother, such that the shechita could be meaningful for the fetus as well as the mother, only because the fetus is alive. And as a live fetus, we can relate the shechita to the fetus itself, not just to the mother. But in a case of Ever di Uber Mes, where the fetus already died, then the shechita could not have any impact on the extended foreleg of the fetus. That's the shita of Rav Chizda, but Rabbah disagrees, and he says kishem, just like machlokes bazeh, kach machlokes bazeh. Meaning that let's take the shita of the Chachamim to the next level and expand it to include even the case of a dead fetus. And the mother shechita is meaningful for the entire fetus, even though the fetus is dead, but it's viewed as part of the body of the mother. And therefore, the shechita will be meaningful even for that extended foreleg, which is part of the fetus. So again, it's like A equals B equals C, meaning the fetus, even though it's dead, is within the body of its mother, and therefore the shechita of the mother is meaningful for the fetus. And then we go on to C, and we say that the extended foreleg of the fetus is part of the body of the fetus, and therefore the shechita, which we said is meaningful for the mother and any part of the mother, meaning the fetus, is now meaningful even for the extended leg, and therefore, according to Rabbah's understanding, the Chachama would still insist that shechita eina osa nipol, which means that the shechita does not create a detachment with that extended leg, but rather on the contrary, the shechita is meaningful even for the extended leg, and that's going to be mitayr that leg midei nevela, from tumas nevela. Here, he says here, Rabbah maintains that even when the fetus is dead, it's viewed as part of the mother to the extent that it itself, meaning the dead fetus in its mother's womb, can be considered geschachten, as if the shechita related it through the mother's shechita. So the protruding limb is now subject to the impact of the shechita, and that shechita on that limb, again, keep in mind that according to Chacham, that limb is a treifa because it was extended outside of the womb of its mother, outside of its mechitza. So now the treifa is subject to a mitaher of shechita, because as we said many times over and over again, the Gemara is going to later on establish this as machlokas, but we assume, and that's the generally accepted opinion, that the shechita of a treifa, although it's not meaningful to allow consumption, but it does effectuate tahara. Okay, now we're going to really get into this question of whether or not the ubar, the fetus in its mother's womb, has the shechita of the mother, meaning the mother's shechita relates even to the fetus. Our Mishnah says ben shmona chai. The Mishnah has a whole list of cases in which the shechita does not effectuate a tara on tumas nevela. And why is that? Because it's ein b'mino royal shechita. In other words, if you have something that it is in a kind, meaning in a species, a category of included in shechita, then the shechita is meaningful, and even if it's a treifa, it could be mitayr midei nevela. But if you have something like a ben shmona is called a nefel, meaning the assumption is that in the case of a cow, for example, if the calf inside the mother's cow is only 8 months old and the gestation period takes 9 months, then in such a case, that ben shmona, according to the Mishnah, is not subject to shechita. Why? Because the animal is going to die. It's not going to survive. And now the Gemara asks for Tanya. We have a brisa that says the opposite. Ben shmona chai yochiach. Now, this word yochiach, which means to demonstrate something, is really part of a longer brisa, which is not quoted here in the text of our Gemara. This brisa, which is from Torah's Kohanim, is part of the whole discussion about if somebody shechts a treifa animal, does it purify the fetus from tumah? Even though the treifa animal does not lend itself to a heter achila, cannot be eaten, but nevertheless, it's purified by the shechita. And we saw already in our Mishnah that there was a logical analysis of our Mishnah, and that is the following. We start with a non-kosher animal, which you're not allowed to eat. Then we speak about a kosher animal that's treif, that became a treifa. Again, you're not allowed to eat. So the logic went as follows, that just like shechita, in the case of a non-kosher animal, would not remove nevela, so too, shechita in a treif animal, which like a non-kosher animal is prohibited, is not subject to a tara process effectuated by the shechita. And the Mishnah rejects it. The Mishnah says you can't make an analogy between a treifa of a kosher animal to a non-kosher animal, because with regard to a non-kosher animal, it's ein b'mino roy l'shchita. But in the case of a kosher animal, then all the animals of that same min are subject to shchita. This one is not subject to the heter achila of shchita because it became a treifa. And up until this point in the brisa, we have a repetition, almost word for word, logic by logic, step by step, of the Mishnah. But now the brisa wants to come to the opposite conclusion. And how so? From Ben Shmona Chai. Let's say a fetus is born after 8 months of pregnancy, and it's alive. Now, in terms of the min, again, this specific animal is going to die because it's only 8 months pregnant, but the min itself is royal shchita. And yet, the law is that the shchita of a ben chai is not going to be mitayr midei nevela, the tumas nevela. Afal pi sheyesh b'mina shchita. If we compare the ben ches to the normal kind, which would be a ben tes, then it's subject to shchita. Nevertheless, what's the halacha? Ein shchita so mitarasa. And that appears in our Mishnah as well, that an 8-month-old fetus, although it belongs to a min that's royal shchita, nevertheless the shchita does not mitayr midei tumas nevela. So we're really stuck now, because now we're going to say that a treifa, even though it belongs to a min that's royal shchita, nevertheless, since the shchita cannot be mitayr, it cannot be materid, it cannot be mitayr midei tumas nevela. And this brisa is rejecting the entire logic of our Mishnah, because our Mishnah says that a shchita of a treifa is mitayr midei nevela, and in the case of an 8-month-old fetus, it's not royal shchita. It's not subject to shchita. And now, intuitively, I would say the brisa makes more sense, because the brisa is saying that as far as an 8-month-old fetus, the min itself lends itself to shchita. Omer of Kahana, what is the machlokes now between the Mishnah and the brisa? Yesh b'mino shchita agav imo, meaning that the status of an 8-month fetus, is it considered yesh b'mino shchita? The brisa holds that the 8-month-old fetus is considered yesh b'mino shchita. Because what's the difference between the 8-month-old fetus and the 9-month-old fetus? In both cases, it's fit for shchita because it's the same min. The Chachamim, on the other hand, hold Tana Didan, Mina de ime lo parach. So again, the brisa makes sense because the ben ches is considered yesh b'mino roy l'shchita, and from deswegen, even though, nevertheless, the shchita is not mitar midei nevela. So therefore, when you have a treifa, which is yesh b'mino b'shchita, nevertheless, the conclusion should be like in the case of ben ches, according to the brisa's logic, the shchita should not be mitar midei nevela. But our Tana, meaning the Tana of our Mishnah, who rejects this argument and this analogy to the 8th-month fetus, refutes that logic of the Brisa because of Mina de'ime lo parich. In other words, when you want to say that the 8th-month fetus is Mino of Roy, the Chachamim in our Mishnah reject that logic. Because you'll never have a meaningful, effective shechita for an 8th-month fetus. It's a nefel, it won't survive. And the shechita is not meaningful. So in other words, don't look at the min of the mother, according to our Mishnah, but rather look at the min of this fetus, 8-month-old. That fetus itself is Eno Roy L'Shchita. However, in the case of a treifa, anything of that kind is Roy L'Shchita. But the case of a Ben Ches can never be subject to Shchita. It's considered Ein B'mino Roy L'Shchita. So Gemara now comes back to the Bryce. Ulahai Tana de Parich is treifa de Shchita Shitas Mataras Aminola. Meaning, is the Brisa, since logically it rejected the proof that shchita could be effective for a treifa from the fact that shchita is not effective for a ben ches. So now we're out in the cold, and we don't know, according to the Brisa, what is the source from which we derive the conclusion that apparently it was well accepted that the shchita of a treifa is mitayr the treifa midei nevela. And the Gemara answers, Nafkalei mid Rabbi Yehuda Marav, Yom Rabbi Yehuda Marav, Yamili Masnis and Tana, Omar Krav, Chiyamus min ha-behema. And this is a pasuk in Vayikra Perek Yud Aleph, and it says, min ha-behema. What does that mean, min ha-behema? Literally translated, amongst your animals. And the answer is, miktsas behema mitama, miktsas behema ena mitama. In other words, the min ha-behema is separating two different categories of behema as far as tumah is concerned. And therefore, some animals, mixas behema mitama, when they die, they are mitame, and mixas behema ain't mitame. So what kind of an animal is not mitame when it dies? I mean, it's l'chor, it's an avela, and if it's an avela, it certainly should be mitame. And the answer is zu treifa sheshchata, that if you shecht a treifa, then the carcass is not considered a nevela hamitama, and that's the exclusion of min habehem. Boy, Rav Hoshia. Now we get back to the sugya ben pekua. Ben pekua means that there was a fetus inside its mother's womb, and you shechted the mother, and lo and behold, the fetus is alive and well as any other animal. And now the question is, whether or not you could do an let me just see if the English phrase in vitro, I don't know, but that's probably not the right word. Anyway, shchit. So that's called Hoshes Yodo b'mei behema v'shchata. He somehow was able to do a surgery inside by putting the knife inside the womb of the pregnant animal and shachat ben tishachai. The ben pkur was about to be born. It's 9 months old and it's going to be alive. But he shechted it inside the mother's body. Is that a valid shechita or not? Oh, I see. He calls it prenatal shechita. Okay. Tiboy l'Rab Meir, v'tiboy l'Rab Bana. We can equally interpret Rav Hoshaya's vacillation according to both the shita of Rabbi Meir and according to the Rabbanim. Tiboy l'Rabbi Meir. Why is there a suffix according to Rabbi Meir? Because according to Rabbi Meir, the ben pkua requires its own shchita. And now the question is, when does Rabbi Meir require, and it could be that prenatal shchita is not a valid shchita, but when does Rabbi Meir require shchita? That's only after the ben pkua leaves the womb of its mother. But it could very well be that according to Rabbi Meir, if it hasn't yet left the womb of its mother, then it needs shchita. And the question is, he didn't allow the shchita of the mother to be operative and valid for the ben pkua. He went ahead, jumped the gun, and shechted prenatally. Tiboy l'Rabbanan, the Rabbanan hold that the shchita of the mother is meaningful for the fetus. So now the Gemara analyzes. Tiboy l'Rabbi Meir, Ad kan lo kam Rabbi Meir ben Pekua to own shchita. Rabbi Meir holds that the shchita of the mother is not meaningful for the ben Pekua. That's hani mili heichid yotzal yavra olam. That's only after the fetus was born. Aval b'mei ima, as long as the fetus has not yet been born and it's inside its mother's womb, then lo shari le shchita, it requires its own shchita. And now I don't know whether the prenatal shchita is meaningful or not. According to the Rabbanon, a ben pkua does not require shchita because the mother's shchita is meaningful for the ben pkua. And therefore, even after the ben pkua emerges from its mother's womb and stands on all four, nevertheless, it doesn't require shchita. So if that be the case, then if it doesn't require, wait, but there's a little bit of a paradox here. Just 1 second. Right, the shchita is ineffective, and therefore what? Let me just get the logic here for a minute. According to the Rabbanon, who hold that there was shchita on the mother, and at that moment in time, the ben pekua was inside its mother's womb, and therefore the shchita on its mother is meaningful for the what? For the ben pekua. And that means that according to Rabbanan, after the ben pekua is born, it already has shchita. And in this case, what happened? Instead of shechting the mother, while the uber was in its mother's womb, he went ahead and he shechted the uber. That shechita might not be valid. Why? Because as long as it's in its mother's womb, the shechita of the mother is going to be valid for the fetus, not the shechita of the fetus itself. Oh, Dilma, feel the Rabbana. Maybe the Rabbana would hold that the shechita that he does prenatally is effective. Why? Because Arba Simonim Achshabei Rachmana, when the Torah says that the two Simonim of the mother would be matir the ubar, because shechita sa'em mahani labas, then add another two Simonim, and those are the Simonim of the uber itself, meaning of the Ben Pekua. Amarav Chananya, Tashma, we learned it from our Mishnah. Haresha nolda treifa mina beten. An animal was born from the treifa. I'm sorry, the animal was a treifa from the time it came into being. After its conception, it was already a treifa. It never had a moment that it was roy l'shchita. And the Mishnah is saying that you can't do shchita on this treifa, including an animal that developed its, in other words, the shechita has to be after the animal is born. Now, if you're going to tell me that you can do prenatal shechita while the fetus is in its womb, so why do you tell me that it's not roy? It cannot be rendered permissible through shechita, before the fetus was born, he could have shechted the fetus. So therefore, it had a shasa kosher. He could have put his hand inside the womb and slaughtered the fetus before it became a treifa. So at one point in time, it wasn't a treifa. Amalei Rava says, forget Rav Chananya your proof, because Tni, we're going to change the Mishnah, and it's going to be talking about Shenotza Treifim in a beten, that there was never a moment in time that this fetus could have been subject to shchita. Why? Because mishkachas leve balas chamesh raglayim. So we have a halacha that if you have an extra limb, it's as if a limb is missing. So basically, if this fetus has 5 legs, it's considered as if it has 3 legs. And the Mishnah only means to say that a fetus was treifa from the moment that it was created. It was never fit for shechita. But if you have a fetus that was formed normally and developed a treifa defect before its birth, perhaps you could say that you could do prenatal shechita, and the shechita would be matir the fetus. And that leads us here to the Mishnah on the bottom of Ayin Dal. He finds a fetus inside its mother's womb that's in the 8th month. O mes, or a dead fetus. O ben tisha mes, or for that matter, it's a 9-month fetus, but it's dead. Is koro, he tears out the fetus, and he's allowed to eat the meat without shchita. Umotzi es domo. But first, he has to get rid of the dam. He can't eat the dam. The Torah prohibits eating dam. Motza ben tisha chai. If, on the other hand, he finds a fetus in its mother's womb that's 9 months old and it's alive, then ton shchita. We need shchita. Now, all this we have to keep in mind is Rabbi Meir, because Rabbi Meir holds that the shchita of the mother is not meaningful for the ben pekua, for the fetus. So therefore, Matzah ben Tisha Chai ton shchita. Now, according to Rabbi Meir, right? According to Rabbi Meir, one second. How come I don't see Rabbi Meir's name here? Just 1 second. Oh, there it is on top of it. Sorry. So according to Rabbi Meir, the ben pekua, when it lives and it's a 9-month-old fetus and it's born, it requires its own shechita. That shechita is valid. It's a full-fledged shechita, and therefore chayav b'yosef espino. If he would shecht that fetus, that ben pekua, and its mother on the same day, he gets malchus for violating the iser of oso vespino, which is in Vayikra Chav Beis. And since, according to Rabbi Meir, the live 9 months fetus requires shechita, then you cannot shecht it on the same day that you shechted its mother. Divrei Rabbi Meir. Now, Chachamim omrim shchitas imo mitaraso. The ben pekua doesn't require a separate shechita, but rather it comes under the shechita of its mother, and we view the ben pekua as part of its mother, and it's not an independent animal. And now we get to Reb Shimon Shizuri.